Funes, his memory. I recall him, though I have no right to speak that sacred verb. Only one man on earth did, and that man is dead. Holding a dark passion flower in his hand, seeing it as it had never been seen, even had it been stared at from the first light of dawn till the last light of evening for an entire lifetime. I recall him, his taciturn face, its Indian features, its extraordinary remoteness behind the cigarette. I recall, I think, the slender leather braider's fingers. I recall, near those hands, a mate cup with the coat of arms of the Banda Oriental. I recall, in the window of his house, a yellow straw blind with some vague painted lake scene. I clearly recall his voice, the slow, resentful, nasal voice of the toughs of those days, without the Italian sibilants one hears today. I saw him no more than 3 times, the last time in 1887. I applaud the idea that all of us who had dealings with the man should write something about him. My testimony will perhaps be the briefest, and certainly the slightest, account in the volume that you are to publish, but it can hardly be the least impartial. Unfortunately, I am Argentine, and so congenitally unable to produce the dithyramb that is the obligatory genre in Uruguay, especially when the subject is a Uruguayan. Highbrow, dandy, city slicker, Funes did not utter those insulting words, but I know with reasonable certainty that to him I represented those misfortunes. Pedro Leandro Ipuche has written that Funes was a precursor of the race of supermen, a maverick and vernacular Zarathustra, and I will not argue the point, but one must not forget that he was also a street tough from Fray Bentos, with certain incorrigible limitations. My first recollection of Funes is quite clear. I see him one afternoon in March or February of '84. That year, my father had taken me to spend the summer in Fray Bentos. I was coming back from the ranch in San Francisco with my cousin, Bernardo Hedo. We were riding along on our horses, singing merrily, and being on horseback was not the only reason for my cheerfulness. After a sultry day, a huge slate-colored storm, fanned by the south wind, had curtained the sky. The wind flailed the trees wildly, and I was filled with the fear, the hope that we would be surprised in the open countryside by the elemental water. We ran a kind of race against the storm. We turned into the deep bed of a narrow street that ran between 2 brick sidewalks built high up off the ground. It had suddenly got dark. I heard quick, almost secret footsteps above me. I raised my eyes and saw a boy running along the narrow, broken sidewalk high above, as though running along the top of a narrow, broken wall. I recall the short, baggy trousers, like a gaucho's, that he wore, the straw-soled cotton slippers, the cigarette in the hard visage, all stark against the now limitless storm cloud. Unexpectedly, Bernardo shouted out to him, "What's the time, Ireneo?" Without consulting the sky, without a second's pause, the boy replied, 4 minutes till 8, young Bernardo Juan Francisco. The voice was shrill and mocking. I am so absent-minded that I would never have given a second thought to the exchange I've just reported had my attention not been called to it by my cousin, who was prompted by a certain local pride and the desire to seem unfazed by the other boy's trinomial response. He told me that the boy in the narrow street was one Ireneo Funes, and that he was known for certain eccentricities, among them shying away from people and always knowing what time it was, like a clock. He added that Ireneo was the son of a village ironing woman, Maria Clementina Funes, and that, while some people said his father was a doctor in the salting house, an Englishman named O'Connor, others said he broke horses or drove ox carts for a living over in the department of Salto. The boy lived with his mother, my cousin told me, around the corner from Villa Los Laureles. In '85, and 86, we spent the summer in Montevideo. It was not until 87 that I returned to Fray Bentos. Naturally, I asked about everybody I knew, and finally about chronometric Funes. I was told he'd been bucked off a half-broken horse on the ranch in San Francisco and had been left hopelessly crippled. I recall the sensation of unsettling magic that this news gave me. The only time I'd seen him, we'd been coming home on horseback from the ranch in San Francisco, and he had been walking along a high place. This new event, told by my cousin Bernardo, struck me as very much like a dream confected out of elements of the past. I was told that Funes never stirred from his cot, his eyes fixed on the fig tree behind the house or on a spider web. At dusk, he would let himself be carried to the window. He was such a proud young man that he pretended that his disastrous fall had actually been fortunate. Twice I saw him on his cot behind the iron-barred window that crudely underscored his prisoner-like state, once lying motionless, with his eyes closed. The second time, motionless as well, absorbed in the contemplation of a fragrant switch of Artemisia. It was not without some self-importance that about that same time I had embarked upon a systematic study of Latin. In my suitcase, I had brought with me Lumens de Viris Illustribus, Caesarat's Thesaurus, Julius Caesar's Commentaries, and an odd-numbered volume of Pliny's Naturalis Historia, a work which exceeded and still exceeds my modest abilities as a Latinist. There are no secrets in a small town. Ireneo, in his house on the outskirts of the town, soon learned of the arrival of those outlandish books. He sent me a flowery, sententious letter reminding me of our lamentably ephemeral meeting on the 7th of February, 1884. He dwelt briefly, elegiacally, on the glorious services that my uncle, Gregorio Hado, who had died that same year, had rendered to his two motherlands in the valiant battle of Ituzaingo, and then he begged that I lend him one of the books I had brought, along with a dictionary, for a full understanding of the text, since I must plead ignorance of Latin. He promised to return the books to me in good condition, and straightway. The penmanship was perfect, the letters exceptionally well formed. The spelling was that recommended by Andres Bello, I for Y, J for G. At first, of course, I thought it was some sort of joke. My cousin assured me it was not, that this was just Ireneo. I didn't know whether to attribute to brazen conceit, ignorance, or stupidity the idea that hard-won Latin needed no more teaching than a dictionary could give. In order to fully disabuse Funes, I sent him Cicerat's Gradus ad Parnassum and the Pliny. On February 14, I received a telegram from Buenos Aires urging me to return home immediately. My father was not at all well. God forgive me, but the prestige of being the recipient of an urgent telegram, the desire to communicate to all of Fray Bentos the contradiction between the negative form of the news and the absoluteness of the adverbial phrase, the temptation to dramatize my grief by feigning a virile stoicism, all this, perhaps, distracted me from any possibility of real pain. As I packed my bag, I realized that I didn't have the Gradus ad Parnassum and the first volume of Pliny. The Saturn was to sail the next morning. That evening, after dinner, I walked over to Funes's house. I was amazed that the evening was no less oppressive than the day had been. At the honest little house, Funes's mother opened the door. She told me that Ireneo was in the back room. I shouldn't be surprised if I found the room dark, she told me, since Ireneo often spent his off hours without lighting the candle. I walked across the tiled patio and down the little hallway farther on and came to the second patio. There was a grapevine. The darkness seemed to me virtually total. Then suddenly I heard Ireneo's high, mocking voice. The voice was speaking Latin, with morbid pleasure, the voice emerging from the shadows was reciting a speech, or a prayer, or an incantation. The Roman syllables echoed in the patio of hard-packed earth. My trepidation made me think them incomprehensible and endless. Later, during the enormous conversation of the night, I learned they were the first paragraph of the 24th chapter of the 7th book of Pliny's Naturalis Historia. The subject of that chapter is memory. The last words were, ut nihil non istem verbis reteretur auditum. Without the slightest change of voice, Ireneo told me to come in. He was lying on his cot, smoking. I don't think I saw his face until the sun came up the next morning. When I look back, I believe I recall the momentary glow of his cigarette. His room smelled vaguely musty. I sat down. I told him about my father's telegram and my father's illness. I come now to the most difficult point in my story, a story whose only raison d'etre, as my readers should be told from the outset, is that dialogue half a century ago. I will not attempt to reproduce the words of it, which are now forever irrecoverable. Instead, I will summarize faithfully the many things Ireneo told me. Indirect discourse is distant and weak. I know that I am sacrificing the effectiveness of my tale. I only ask that my readers try to hear in their imagination the broken and staccato periods that astounded me that night. Ireneo began by enumerating, in both Latin and Spanish, the cases of prodigious memory catalogued in the Naturalis Historia. Cyrus, the king of Persia, who could call all the soldiers in his army by name. Mithridates Eupator, who meted out justice in the 22 languages of the kingdom over which he ruled. Simonides, the inventor of the art of memory. Metrodorus, who was able faithfully to repeat what he had heard, though it be but once. With obvious sincerity, Ireneo said he was amazed that such cases were thought to be amazing. He told me that before that rainy afternoon, when the blue roan had bucked him off, he had been, what every man was, blind, deaf, befuddled, and virtually devoid of memory. I tried to remind him how precise his perception of time, his memory for proper names had been. He ignored me. He had lived, he said, for 19 years, as though in a dream. He looked without seeing, heard without listening, forgot everything, or virtually everything. When he fell, he'd been knocked unconscious. When he came to again, the present was so rich, so clear, that it was almost unbearable, as were his oldest and even his most trivial memories. It was shortly afterward that he learned he was crippled. Of that fact, he hardly took notice. He reasoned, or felt, that immobility was a small price to pay. Now, his perception and his memory were perfect. With one quick look, you and I perceived 3 wineglasses on a table. Funes perceived every grape that had been pressed into the wine, and all the stalks and tendrils of its vineyard. He knew the forms of the clouds in the southern sky on the morning of April 30, 1882, and he could compare them, in his memory, with the veins in the marbled binding of a book he had seen only once, or with the feathers of spray lifted by an oar on the Rio Negro on the eve of the Battle of Quebranco. Nor were these memories simple. Every visual image was linked to muscular sensations, thermal sensations, and so on. He was able to reconstruct every dream, every daydream he had ever had. 2 or 3 times he had reconstructed an entire day. He had never once erred or faltered, but each reconstruction had itself taken an entire day. I, myself, alone, have more memories than all mankind since the world began, he said to me. And also, my dreams are like other people's waking hours. And again, toward dawn. My memory, sir, is like a garbage heap, a circle drawn on a blackboard, a right triangle, a rhombus. All these are forms we can fully intuit. Ireneo could do the same with the stormy mane of a young colt, a small herd of cattle on a mountainside, a flickering fire and its uncountable ashes. and the many faces of a dead man at a wake. I have no idea how many stars he saw in the sky. There are things he told me. Neither then nor later have I ever doubted them. At that time, there were no cinematographers, no phonographs. It nevertheless strikes me as implausible, even incredible, that no one ever performed an experiment with Funes. But then, all our lives, we postpone everything that can be postponed. Perhaps we all have the certainty, deep inside, that we are immortal, and that, sooner or later, every man will do everything, know all there is to know. The voice of Funes from the darkness went on talking. He told me that in 1886 he had invented a numbering system original within himself, and that, within a very few days, he had passed the 24,000 mark. He had not written it down, since anything he thought, even once, remained ineradicably with him. His original motivation, I think, was his irritation that the 33 Uruguayan patriots should require 2 fingers and 3 words, rather than a single figure, a single word. He then applied this mad principle to the other numbers. Instead of 7013, 7013, he would say, for instance, Maximo Perez. Instead of 7014, 7014, the railroad. Other numbers were Louis Melian Lefineur, or Limar, sulfur, clubs, the whale, gas, a stew pot, Napoleon, Augustin de Verdier. Instead of 500, 500, he said 9. Every word had a particular figure attached to it, a sort of marker. The later ones were extremely complicated. I tried to explain to Funes that his rhapsody of unconnected words was exactly the opposite of a number system. I told him that when one said 365, one said 3 hundreds, 6 tens, and 5 ones, a breakdown impossible with the numbers nigger to Mateo, or a poncho full of meat. Funes either could not or would not understand me. In the 17th century, Locke postulated and condemned an impossible language in which each individual thing, every stone, every bird, every branch, would have its own name. Funes once contemplated a similar language, but discarded the idea as too general, too ambiguous. The truth was, Funes remembered not only every leaf of every tree in every patch of forest, but every time he had perceived or imagined that leaf. He resolved to reduce every one of his past days to some 70,000 recollections, which he would then define by numbers. 2 considerations dissuaded him: the realization that the task was interminable, and the realization that it was pointless. He saw that by the time he died, he would still not have finished classifying all the memories of his childhood. The 2 projects I have mentioned, an infinite vocabulary for the natural series of numbers, and a pointless mental catalogue of all the images in his memory, are foolish, even preposterous, but they reveal a certain halting grandeur. They allow us to glimpse, or to infer, the dizzying world that Funes lived in. Funes, we must not forget, was virtually incapable of general Platonic ideas. Not only was it difficult for him to see that the generic symbol dog took in all the dissimilar individuals of all shapes and sizes, it irritated him that the dog of 3:14 in the afternoon, seen in profile, should be indicated by the same noun as the dog of 3:15, seen frontally. His own face in the mirror, his own hands, surprised him every time he saw them. Swift wrote that the Emperor of Lilliput could perceive the movement of the minute hand of a clock. Funes could continually perceive the quiet advances of corruption, of tooth decay, of weariness. He saw, he noticed, the progress of death, of humidity. He was the solitary, lucid spectator of a multiform, momentaneous, and almost unbearably precise world. Babylon, London, and New York dazzle mankind's imagination with their fierce splendor. No one in the populous towers or urgent avenues of those cities has ever felt the heat and pressure of a reality as inexhaustible as that which battered Ireneo day and night in his poor South American hinterland. It was hard for him to sleep. To sleep is to take one's mind from the world. Funes, lying on his back on his cot, in the dimness of his room, could picture every crack in the wall, every moulding of the precise houses that surrounded him. I repeat that the most trivial of his memories were more detailed, more vivid than our own perception of a physical pleasure or a physical torment. Off toward the east, in an area that had not yet been cut up into city blocks, there were new houses, unfamiliar to Ireneo. He pictured them to himself as black, compact, made of homogeneous shadow. He would turn his head in that direction to sleep. He would also imagine himself at the bottom of a river, rocked and negated by the current. He had effortlessly learned English, French, Portuguese, Latin. I suspect, nevertheless, that he was not very good at thinking. To think is to ignore or forget differences, to generalize, to abstract. In the teeming world of Ireneo Funes, there was nothing but particulars, and they were virtually immediate particulars. The leery light of dawn entered the patio of packed earth. It was then that I saw the face that belonged to the voice that had been talking all night long. Ireneo was 19. He had been born in 1868. He looked to me as monumental as bronze, older than Egypt, older than the prophecies and the pyramids. I was struck by the thought that every word I spoke, every expression of my face or motion of my hand would endure in his implacable memory. I was rendered clumsy by the fear of making pointless gestures. Ireneo Funes died in 1889 of pulmonary congestion.